Well, we're going to have a very short talk tonight because it's a subject I want to treat thoroughly. In fact, we're not even going to finish it tonight, even with one talk. And we're going to return to something that was mentioned at the end of the talk previous to this. And the reason I want to revisit is because this subject might be the most important topic in all of the talks in this entire series. And the reason that is true is because mysticism is not valuable unless you can live in harmony with the spiritual reality at which mysticism points. It's a big difference between the reality and what mysticism itself is. It's good to talk about things and read things, but what really counts is our lives. The life that we live is all important. Therefore, we want to do things that help us live better lives. And so we're talking about something that will help us live better. And in mysticism, that means we're going to talk about retrospection. It has been credited with being the most effective and the most efficient exercise for spiritual growth and development. This is by quite a few people. I can personally vouch for that. My growth has not been great, but during the course of my life, the periods that I put the most into retrospection are the periods that my consciousness changed for the better the most. There may be other methods for spiritual becoming, but of all of the ones that I have tried myself, retrospection is clearly the most effective of all of them. And I'm at an age now that I'm looking back at life, and when you do that, you have some regrets. And one of the greatest regrets I have is that I didn't put more into doing this exercise. I think I could have gone much further with developing my consciousness as a force for the good. First, let's begin to describe the exercise in a very brief way. It is performed at the end of the day, depending on what hour you are done with your day. For some people, it would be in the sunlight. A person relaxes, and that is, for some people, a challenge in itself. Some people do not know how to relax. It is best performed lying on one's back in bed. And that is also a challenge, because for most people, being in a relaxed state, lying in bed, means falling asleep. And it takes will and a very loving sacrifice to stay awake. It's not surprising, though for a slightly different reason, that mystics through the ages, many of them have developed a healthy disdain for sleep because of the loss of consciousness. If you really want to grow spiritually, you make the sacrifice of staying awake, which is not easy to do. The difficulty in staying awake is due to several factors. And one of those factors is internal resistance. We've mentioned it many times that what we think we are is a very divided thing. and we're not completely conscious of all of the things that happen to us. We're not completely conscious of the divine creativity of ourselves, and it's almost a surprise to us when it comes out. We're also not conscious of that internal adversary, that things slip out of us that we would wish never would come out, but we just don't realize that that calls a lot of the shots in our lives. That same inner adversary that we struggle with when we're in our better self. Historically, it has had the purpose of defending us, looking out for number one, and it did a really good job at that. And then it realized that it could strengthen and perpetuate its own case. That pseudo-self doesn't really think, and it isn't really creative, but there's a kind of cunning to it. And in that cunning, it knows that if it is properly tamed and it is to be a junior partner to the true self, the better self, it's going to lose that position that it has for itself. It would no longer be a despot. Despot? And so, what it does, it takes us out of the body in sleep rather than cede its own power. The same thing is current or present in all different parts of our lives. Forgetting. It's a very good example. Sometimes it's much easier to forget some things than to remember them, because remembering them would be a challenge to the supremacy of our egoism, or other unlikable things would be the result of remembering. I can state, for example, that I have friends and I interact with these friends regularly, and they owe me money. And they have so conveniently forgotten that they would be shocked if I brought it to their attention that they owe me money. You know, I guess you don't say anything if you want to have friends. After all, what one does at the end of the day is, in a relaxed state, review the events of the day. And you review them in reverse order. And the reverse order is important. It means when we're doing this that we are volitionally doing what happens at death when one is alive. Now, there are a number of reasons why the reverse order, and we'll cover most of those reasons. But each one of the reasons for doing things in reverse order produces a difficulty. This is such a simple exercise, but it's just fraught with difficulties. You can describe the whole exercise in about 5 minutes' time. But there are all kinds of subtle difficulties that come up. Nobody ever said spiritual development would be easy, because if it were easy, there would be saints on every street corner, and that's not the case. At least this kind of exercise is safe, and it's effective, and it makes better people. It isn't necessarily, it's very powerful if you want to learn to leave your body. suddenly you start doing it, you recognize currents in yourself and centers in yourself that are pretty powerful. But the good part of it is you're becoming a better person, a more ethical person, a more moral person. Notice things are a little bit different, because when you're looking back and you're still alive in the body, you're going against the grain. At death, everything is unwinding, and you're going with the grain when you're looking back. But while you're in the physical body, you're going against the course of things. You're swimming upstream. You're swimming against that force that we call the will to live or the will to create. That wants to keep going forward. So what we're talking about here is not just reminiscing. We're talking about a serious application of will. And the application of will is a very subtle thing. A spiritual human is the opposite of a natural human. The natural human would go to sleep. Just that easy. Becoming divine and becoming individually free requires will. So this is an exercise that develops the will at the same time that you're developing spiritually and morally. When one focuses on a memory image, to go to the image that preceded it seems almost impossibly difficult at times, especially if it's something that there is resistance involved. Part of the reason it's difficult is because you're swimming upstream. Part of it is due to the internal resistance. But a lot of it is just causing things to go the opposite direction from the way that they are normally going. The reason why you focus on an image is you're trying to get in touch, not with what is called the brain memory, but you're trying to get in touch with the etheric panorama that we spoke of last time. That memory is unbiased. It's just a natural recording, just like the recorder that we have here. It's recording everything, good, bad, and indifferent. These images, if you want to call them images, have phenomenal accuracy. Some of the things that you recall are things that you didn't see when you lived in the moment, because your consciousness wasn't that expanded. It's recorded whether you realize it in the moment or whether you realize it in retrospection. That's one of the things. You always get better at retrospection, and you notice things you didn't notice before. This is important because what we're doing when we're accessing that memory is we are harvesting the effects of our life. What we live for, to what purpose, that's all being harvested. Now in this, there is another trial, in that when we get into the etheric memory and start following it in reverse order, it takes you right out of the physical body. And you have to will yourself to stay in, because you slip out and you go to sleep, even though you're trying to. Relaxation isn't the only thing, and the lower nature isn't the only thing that takes you out of the body. It's that when you do things in reverse order, it has that effect of taking you out of the body. If you see a hypnotist who's hypnotizing somebody, they never count forward when they're taking you out of the body. They do that when they're taking you back in. When you're going out of the body, it's always in reverse order. So, once again, the whole business is a sacrifice of all of our attention and all of our will to harvest what we have that we can harvest and use to our betterment and the betterment of the world. Now I have to correct a little bit. I've said a lot of things about how difficult this exercise is. And that needs to be corrected, because otherwise this will be a very discouraging talk. I'll be talking about something that's impossible for anyone to do. The exercise is really a very simple exercise. Anyone should be able to do it, but you have to want to do it. You have to want to do it with all of your being, or it is going to happen that way. If you want spiritual growth, if you want to move ahead in evolution, you've got to be able to do this. You have to have the strength and be able to apply it. I'm just trying to say that spiritual growth is character growth, and it is not automatic. We don't become better people automatically. Some people stumble into it by suffering from their causes, but spiritual growth is not an automatic thing. You got to put something into it. And it's a matter of practice. Even though it is extremely difficult at first, it's something that by doing it, you get better. It's like learning to play a musical instrument. First you start with simple little pieces, and eventually you get into very complicated, with several different lines of melody going at the same time. It's that sort of thing. You can go as far as you want to go. It's the kind of spiritual exercise that is open-ended. Now, there are some differences between retrospection and the review that happens at the end of life. At death, one merely looks at the images with more or less intense fascination. The more intensely interested you are in the images that are passing before your consciousness, the better it is. In the retrospection exercise, we're trying to condense several steps of the cycle of rebirth. We're trying to do something more. We're trying to not only see the images, but we're trying to process the content of them. Again, this facet of the performance can be done progressively. You can start out with simple things, the very obvious things, and then you can get more and more thorough about what you get out of it. Very few people have what is called photographic memory. We all have the memory, only few people can access it. And almost anyone with practice can learn to access it. There are memory courses that are available that you can take weekend seminars and improve yourself a great deal, but that's a different kind of thing than what we're trying to do here. But the one thing that is common to both is that practice does perfect the ability. It's not in the spirit of this exercise to expect it to be perfect and have total recall at the very beginning. Very few people have that, and usually they are people who have worked on it in a previous rebirth. And you want to avoid dwelling on it. You can get a perfect image of your bathroom but there's not a great deal that you can get out of brushing your teeth when you review it, as it's a limited thing. Now, some people do try to get the perfect image, and they focus on doing that and that only. And it's a talent, but usually it's a distraction from the higher purpose. And what I found is that people that focus on the memory only soon quit out of discouragement because they feel they're getting nothing out of it. What one wants to focus on are the character issues, the moral issues. And I can feel the waves already, because character issues are usually people issues. And most of our attitudes and actions, whether good or not good, are interactions with others. And they aren't necessarily even interactions. My life now is pretty monkish. I live a solitary life. Many days, most days, I don't talk to anyone all day. Nonetheless, when I work at reviewing my day, I find that there are good attitudes and bad attitudes, and some of the things I think about other people are not helpful to them. I try not to ever have anything that's harmful to others. And I have some bad attitudes with relation to people I don't even know. Especially in this election season, it's easy to have bad attitudes about people that you don't know and who probably need more help than they need the negativity directed toward them. Now, what happens when you have well-educated and inquiring people hearing words like good and bad? They tend to be wary, or they close up right away, because that describes most of us, and most of us have been subjected to value systems that were artificial, and we could see through them, and we came into our own as individuals by discarding them. However, just because there are false or archaic or limited value systems doesn't mean that there is no value reality. That would be false to think that way. There are cosmic values, but because we have our own beliefs, we would be very surprised in meeting a lot of cosmic values. So the spiritual worlds are a moral and ethical reality. It's not necessarily trying to teach someone something, some lesson, some specific, like saying, I'm going to teach you a lesson about this. But in the experience of the nature of desire, suppose you get angry at someone and you feel the anger back, you automatically realize that, hey, this is not a good and helpful thing to anyone, either the person who is angry or the person who is the recipient of that anger. It's not a good thing at all, and you know without a doubt that it's a moral reality about these things. Now, retrospection is an exercise that is a means to come to the realization of the moral reality of the world. And because it involves understanding the meaning of events, it is somewhat judicial. And when you hear words like judicial, well-educated and inquiring people become very, very cautious. Even some that are good and decent people, they have wariness from statements in the Bible like, "Judge not, lest ye be judged." Being somewhat of an iconoclast, I've never much refrained from judgment all of my life. And I can say with complete honesty that I have benefited from judgment. Even when I have been wrong in my judgment, and it came back for me to be judged, I've always benefited from it. So when it says, "Judge not, lest ye be judged," the "lest ye be judged" isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's only when judgment is final or demeaning or prejudicial or something like that that it's detrimental. I do a lot with astrology, and astrology with people that have very different value systems than my own. And in order to be able to understand them or to work with them, I have to be very accurate. And in order to be accurate in astrology, you have to have good judgment. You have to know yourself in such a way that you can judge and realize that you're not being prejudiced. This is why in the Greek mystery schools, it was etched in stone, "Gnothi se autan," know thyself. If a person doesn't know one's self, especially in spiritual matters, you can get yourself and a lot of other people into big trouble. Now, the judgment that is used in retrospection is not an adjudicative kind of judgment. It is much more of an intuitive judgment. One looks at and experiences something from the past, and one tries to judge it, and one intuitively understands what it means, because things are so obvious that they stand for themselves. They are self-evident. Of course, again, this is something that we begin with very rough judgments and very obvious things. If you cursed somebody out, it's pretty obvious what you've done, what you projected out there. But it keeps getting much and more subtle. That's the whole thing of spiritual life. It's being more subtle and being able to differentiate more things. And the more you can differentiate, the more you can see a common truth between them, or among them, or within them. Of course, if we progress in self-judgment by retrospection or other ways, we find all sorts of nuances in our behavior. It is surprising how cunning and subtle the egoism is within one. So, if we really want to know the truth about ourselves, the divinity within will spare no pains to bring that knowledge to us. And it usually comes with intuition teamed up with judgment and conscience. You have to really want it, though, because you can't even remember without really wanting it. Now, for some people who are dedicated and who want an objectivity that is not personal or is not likely to be biased, for some people, they retrospect as though they were confessing their life to Christ, which takes a lot of courage. And it's a really very good way to do it, especially if you are a devotional kind of person and you recognize that there is a truth that is divine, and you are in awe of it, or you're humbled by it. Now, provided you don't get too elaborate, that's a really good way to go about it. Now, we have to clarify that this is not a mental exercise, and it's not just developing a photographic memory. There has to be something more, and that something more is feeling. You cannot benefit from retrospection without feeling. You have to feel what you have done, and you have to feel the consequences of what you have done. It's not a matter of dogma or of doctrine. It is about the nature of reality. This is one thing in which retrospection is different from viewing the past life panorama out of the ethers. When you look at the images right after death, it's a neutral process. You're just like flipping through a book, looking at pictures or something like that. You try to do it as intently as you can, but the feeling part comes later, comes much later in the life cycle than the image viewing. In retrospection, it's different. One views the images and re-feels the feelings as thoroughly as possible. If one is using what is called brain memory, I don't know if that's the right way to go about it, it's much more difficult. The so-called brain memory that we use with all kinds of associations and things like that seems to be not as inclusive as the etheric memory. The etheric memory is whole. The difference in the means of memory is built right into our language. On the one hand, in our language, we recall things. That is, we call back images from the etheric record. On the other hand, we remember. And to remember means to put the members back together. Put the pieces together to try to get the whole. It's much more of a rational process. It's more at the positive pole of the reflecting ether than at the negative pole. So it has some drawbacks to it. But if it works as a means to get you to the images where the essence of the experience is stored, it's all right to do that, but sometime you have to graduate to recalling. Eventually, with determination and practice, one is able to call back the etheric records. The resistance, without frightening, can't be overemphasized, except when the lower nature throws the resistance in your face in order to distract us and to cower us from actually doing it. Eventually, when we are morally and psychologically clean, everything in memory should be accessible at will. Everything. You should be able to remember everything. You're going to do it after death, and there are people that have learned how to do this so that they can bring everything, every little detail, every little feeling. Now that seems impossible, especially when it seems like, you're trying to move huge boulders just in order to get your memory to go backwards. You can, I do it sitting up, and you can sit there for a long time to call up the next image, and you have to really want it. Now, while we're speaking of reconstructive remembering as a means to an end, we can recall something parallel. Many people are emotionally inhibited. A lot of other people are emotionally undeveloped. They have a small spectrum of emotions. For the most part, many people are not conscious of their emotions. Just as they are not conscious of the subconscious machinations of the pseudo-self. Thus, it's very difficult to get in touch with the emotions in the etheric panorama, especially since the emotions in the etheric panorama are not as intense as they are in the desire world. Because of this, some mystics and some practitioners suggest using the mind to simulate the emotions in an event as a means to get at the real emotions that are stored in the ethers. I think that's a pretty dicey thing to do, because it can lead to reading things into events that were not originally in them, for whatever reason one would want to read in. The result would be falsity. It would be phoniness. It would be a terrible kind of casuistry, or some kind of self-justification. If one is conscious of what one is doing and never lets go of what one is doing deliberately, it might be all right if you're very, very careful. But the important thing to do is to do the refeeling. Speaking personally, I am of the opinion that it is better to try to directly call up the images, emotions, and all, even if it's harder than pulling teeth. Because I just don't want to go out on any more epicycles of false views of things. After all, we're trying to trust the spirit within, and we're trying to know ourselves, and we're trying to improve ourselves, so it should be worth the effort, even though the struggle might be humiliating for how weak we are. There is a reason for refeeling being so important. Every time we emote or we desire, we produce a form in the desire world, and even one in the etheric subdivision. It's not a form like a cylinder or a pyramid is a form, nothing definite like that. It's something much more like a little wisp of emotion stuff or desire stuff. And that little wisp carries the life of the emotion and the desire that created it. It lives. And they can carry on and they can endure quite a while. It all depends on the intensity of the original emotion or desire. Then by the law of attraction, these little wisps are attracted to each other if they're of a common subject or of a common ilk. And they then produce much more complicated desire forms. And sometimes they coalesce and become pretty distinct desire forms. Corresponding to these desire forms are what psychologists call complexes or constellations. Some of them are benign, some people even think helpful, and others, mostly others, are detrimental. They're detrimental because they have a tendency to influence future behavior. So from the viewpoint of the mystic who wants to live truth and live life spontaneously, they're probably all detrimental. We should have no preconceived notions, no habitual means of acting. For many people, they are an encumbrance. Probably every human being that we know carries around these undischarged emotions in complexes or one big complex. And that's what we could say, that person's carrying around a lot of emotional baggage. It's a slang term, but it's a very good slang term. So we have a lot of desire world energy tied up in these things. And they accumulate throughout a lifetime. And some of them don't even get dissolved after we die for some people if they're really severe. And the influence from them inhibits other actions, inhibits spontaneous living, so that we're living in the influence of our own past. It would be so much better to live a life where we can create each new feeling fresh and to be free to do that, rather than carrying around what some call the burden of sin, is what it's been called in Orthodox Christianity. That's emotional freedom. It's a wonderful thing. If a person has developed the ability to feel emotions without any predisposition and can express them at will, that's spontaneous creation. So we can see from this, even though it's not the main intent of what we're talking about, that freedom is a talent. In this case, it's a talent to feel without bias from our own past. Now, to understand how this works in retrospection, let's go back to one of those very first principles that we talked about at the beginning of this series of talks, which must have been at least 5 years ago. Some people call it the principle of cause and effect. Others call it cause and consequence. For many things in cosmology, which is a live, ongoing thing, it's much better to think of it in terms of action and reaction. Effects are a good way to look at things in the more static physical world, because this is all about form. Things are different in the inner worlds. Life is of greater importance than form. The feeling that's in those wisps is more important than the form of them. The form follows after feeling. And the further one proceeds into the spiritual worlds, the more life becomes important over form. So from what we've said in the last few minutes, it's clear that desire and etheric forms endure because the life endures. Now, using the principle as action and reaction represents a kind of a neutralization. If a desire force is met with something that feels almost like an equal and opposite force from the experience of the Creator, there is a neutralization. For want of a better word in our language, that, how would you say it, that inverse feeling that neutralizes the original feeling, the two together produce a whole. And that whole is not polarized, or is not charged the way its components are. The word in our English language, which isn't there, so we're going to create it, the best word would be to call it refeeling, using the prefix much as we use it in resetting. Though if we refeel an emotion or a desire expression, the expression is neutralized. And in that, it isn't a neutralization where something is lost, but the emotional power or the emotional dynamism is free. It's not tied up, doesn't have to be there anymore. This is why in experiencing a memory record, it's a much better way than to simulate, because we're getting the exact thing that does the neutralization. We're going to go into more of this the next time because it fits into the whole cosmological cycle we're looking at. If we relive the experience in recall, we can refeel exactly in quantity and intensity what we have done. This way, the neutralization is effective. However, in re-experiencing from the etheric records, neutralization is not guaranteed. It depends on the psychology of the individual. I have heard many times when mentioning this exercise to people, someone will say something to the effect of, I have remembered this horrible traumatic experience many times and it still haunts me. In those cases, I never doubt the honesty of the speaker. But on the other hand, I never doubt the principle of neutralization either. I don't want to sound like I'm insensitive or I'm glib, but it seems to me that kind of remembering is remembering to remember and not remembering to be cleared. That sort of thing happens if a person has been raped or tortured or something like that. There is, in the short-term consciousness of this life and this life alone, there is this feeling of sense of horrible injustice. I have been wronged. I have been abused. This is a terrible thing done to me. It almost seemed to me that the individual couldn't believe that it was something to do with their past lives. And they're more interested in justifying themselves in their seeming innocence that they have been seriously wronged than they are in becoming cleared of the whole situation. You can see that this is something that happens quite frequently. This is the kind of thing that happens when we refuse to admit a reality of a situation. In refusing to admit to the reality, we harden ourselves. And that hardening can come close to insanity. In any case, there has to be complete refueling in order for there to be neutralization. Doesn't mean that everything has gone away, but it means that it's no longer a charged thing in your own personal existence. I am always in awe, and it happens, you see it every now and then, where somebody will be murdered. And then the parent of the person who has been murdered is deeply involved with some kind of spiritual seeking, and it's painful and it's hard and it's everything else, but they forgive. They forgive the person that murdered their own child. And it's not just a shallow forgiveness, it's a real forgiveness. And I'm in awe of those kinds of people, because those are people who are free. Those are people who are cleared because they have re-experienced it, and in that re-experience they have known or seen something greater than just feeling that this was an unjust thing done to my child. Doesn't mean that we look at things as if nothing has ever happened. We remember that in this there is a self, a spiritual being that is doing the retrospection, that is doing the watching. And in the intentional neutralization, the self-awareness, the awareness of who is seeing or who is neutralizing or who is forgiving, because this exercise is sometimes called the forgiveness of sins, is a spiritual inward awakening. It's a very opening and humbling thing to say, yes, I did that, and that was the result of it. Reality, if we bring it home and bring it home completely, not just in a realist who is just a hard nose, is something indubitable. Sometimes, because there is a knowing in this, that the Spirit knows what has happened, there is a tendency to make this exercise an intellectual exercise, which is a mistake. It's a mistake because the mind cannot neutralize emotions. The mind can direct emotions, it can initiate emotions, but it can't undo emotions. This is why the kinds of psychotherapy that are mental psychotherapy aren't always successful. When there's feeling, there's a much greater likelihood of success. The Spirit does work through the mind, and it takes intuitions and insights from reflecting on things, but that isn't a mental activity. So if you try to make retrospection a mental exercise, it won't have its effect. If you're afraid that you're going to lose intellectual understanding, or insight into yourself or into life or into the world, you don't have to worry about that. If you do the retrospection with feeling, the insights will come in their own time. You want to be focused on what's happening right now. All right, that's as much as I had time for this time around. And we'll continue from here next time, and we'll summate and we'll bring in some things that tie it back into the life cycle, because there are some very important principles that take place at that time. But just remember for now that this is a safe and effective means for spiritual growth. It's our future, and if we can step into the future more quickly and more efficiently and more accurately in the way we live our lives, the better it is for us. Remember, we don't meet now for 3 weeks, because next week is a week off for gardening, and then come back again.
Will you take questions?
Sure.
So in terms of memory, well, my first question is, let's say you lose your keys, and then you think about, okay, I went in the house, and then I did this, and then I did that. You're going from the past forward.
Mm-hmm.
And this is going from the present backward. And that's important because it's unwinding the experience?
Yes. We're going to talk about that next time, but we're going from consequence to cause.
Oh, okay.
And you have a more complete understanding of an event when you can see from consequence back to cause, and then you can, you will know not only that you lost, where you lost your keys, but you'll understand what it was that distracted you when you set the keys down somewhere that you don't normally set them, or something like that, because you're going from consequence to cause. You can see that I ended up in this state because of this, going backwards.
Okay, and once you get to an event, and you're going back, and you get to an event that you're trying to image and understand the feelings that were involved,
Yeah.
that then you're again going forward when you get to that place, and you, no, not so
No,
much.
you keep going backwards.
Okay.
I find that I can't always keep going backwards. It's sort of like if you've ever seen a map of a retrograde of a planet. It goes forward, and then it makes a little bit of reverse, and then it goes forward again. I find myself doing that because I just can't, if the people who really excel at this get themselves into a state where they can see the images and move them backward, just like you had a film or something like that. You could just turn everything in reverse.
Okay. Now, after death, it's all going back like a flip book or something
Yep.
like that. And it's coming from our body.
It's from the energies that are being released from the part of the ethers that it was holding our body together. I don't know how to say it any other way. And when the energy is released from that, we're going to come up to that in maybe the next talk. When the energies are released, the part of the ethers that held the physical body together, cell for cell, atom for atom, molecule for molecule, when they're released, that is left behind, sort of like a ghost. It's the more immortal part, the spiritual essence of our etheric nature we carry with us, but it's getting way ahead, and a very
Right.
quick superficial statement of it.
I was just thinking about someone with Alzheimer's who has plaques and neurofibrillary tingles, and they can still extract the memories.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, because you had a memory wasting disease at the end of your life, that doesn't in the least distract from the etheric panorama.
Okay.
That's going on all the time anyway, as long as you're breathing. But some people don't want to face certain things, and there's an instinctive knowing. And as a consequence, rather than accept reality, they brace themselves. And when something horrible is happening, they hold their breath because they don't want to see it. Okay.
Can I ask one last?
Yeah.
One? You said you were talking about the desire that we create forms sort of like a wisp type thing and is subject to laws of attraction and repulsion.
Mm-hmm.
And that in the spiritual worlds, life is more important than form. But these sorts of things carry on one after.
Yeah, you're also in the future again there.
Okay, all right. All right.
Well,
It's just so interesting.
Yeah, no, I think it's a very good sign because it indicates that you're anticipating and you're having questions about the nature of reality, and you say, well, if this is true, then what about this? That's actually what your questions are. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.